Hello and welcome to the Business Talk podcast. I'm your host Deepak. I'm honored to welcome Professor Glen Whyte, Professor of Organizational Behavior and Human Resource Management at Rotman School of Management, University of Toronto, as our esteemed guest on today's podcast episode. Professor Whyte joined the University of Toronto in 1998 and has since led various programs and chaired multiple initiatives for the university. Professor Glen specializes in research on judgment and decision making at both individual and group levels, with a focus on managerial negotiations. He previously served as Associate Dean of Curriculum at Rotman and currently holds the position of Academic Director for the Rotman and Institute of Corporate Directors Education Program. With extensive experience in corporate and public sector consulting, he provides expert guidance on negotiation strategies, dispute resolution, risk management, and corporate governance. Professor Glen Whyte holds a PhD, MPhil, and MA from Yale University, a JD from Osgood Law School, and an MBA from the University of Toronto. In this episode, Professor Glen Whyte will share valuable insights from his research, decision failures, why they occur, and how to prevent them. So without further delay, let's extend a warm welcome to Professor Glen Whyte on the podcast. Professor Glen Whyte, it is an honor and privilege to have you join us today.
Thank you, Deepak. The pleasure is mine.
Yeah. Professor, your research focuses on failed decisions. What exactly is a decision failure or fiasco?
Yeah, it's a good question because researchers talk about this subject differently from perhaps normal people, regular people. So we're not really talking about decisions necessarily that have ended in a disaster. When researchers talk about decision failures, they're much more inclined to look at the process by which the decision was made. And was it made poorly? Were there many mistakes made during the process of decision making? So it's not really about taking a decision that ended badly and retrospectively saying that must have been a bad decision. It's much more about the process, how the process, the decision making process, how that unfolded. Was it a good process or was it a bad process? If it was a bad process, then undoubtedly avoidable errors were made that could have been prevented. And the more errors that are made during the process of decision making, the more likely it's going to end up badly. It's going to end up in a way that was not intended by those who made them. So it's much more focused on the process of decision making rather than the outcomes. Because and if you think about it, we're talking decision under risk. We're talking ultimately about high stakes decisions, decisions that have long-term consequences that are tough to change. And it may be that, you make a decision poorly and that for reasons totally fortuitous, it ends up turning out well. And similarly, you might have made a really good decision, but because of events beyond your control, it turns out badly. So that's why the focus is much more about the process by which the decision was made.
Professor, what are some of the leading explanations, theories to explain why smart people means accomplished leaders make choices that hurt not only themselves but others?
Yeah, it's again a good place to start because there are obviously many reasons to potentially explain why smart people make bad choices. So in some sense, that eliminates the explanation of stupidity, which of course underlies, no doubt, some historically significant, egregious decisions. And of course, there's the 7 deadly sins, which are, pride, greed, wrath, lust, envy, gluttony, sloth. So these human failings, these human frailties, may explain some bad decisions. Certainly, they can explain some egregious failures of individual judgment. But I think, Deepak, we're talking about major decision failure. These are almost inevitably the products of a social process. These are almost inevitably product of a group decision-making process. So an interesting question is, why would the flawed judgments of the individual, even the leader, survive the scrutiny of a competent senior management team? That really is a related question here. So that, in some sense, eliminates these explanations. They probably wouldn't survive the scrutiny of a competent team of individuals. So the leading explanation for why senior management, senior leadership teams make on occasion bad decisions that were made badly and that truly ended up harming their own and other interests, is something called groupthink. And groupthink to this day is the leading explanation for flawed group judgment, which is interesting because it really, although it's certainly very much embedded in the popular culture, there's not a lot of empirical support behind this particular theory. The dominant cause of groupthink, according to Irving Janis, who developed this theory called groupthink, is a high level of group cohesiveness. And there's actually not a lot of empirical evidence that that groups that make egregious decisions are typically contaminated by these excessive levels of cohesiveness. So yet we have to come up with a better theory because the evidence doesn't support the dominant theory. But groupthink is definitely the leading theory by far with respect to explaining decision failure in the context of competent, ethical top management teams.
Very insightful. Professor White, your research highlights how decision framing influencing risk perception. Why do individuals tend to take more risk when faces potential losses than when considering potential gains?
Well, we can certainly talk about decision framing, which can occur both individually and collectively. It certainly, I think, is one key factor in why groups make bad choices. I think you also have to add there are other explanations as well, including delusional beliefs about your capacities. I mean, decision framing a tendency for, well, let me get to the issue of risk and framing. So there is a massive amount of empirical evidence suggesting that individuals tend to be risk-seeking in the domain of losses when they're choosing between negative options, but risk-averse in the domain of gains. So I'll give you an example, Deepak. I'm going to ask you to choose what's behind door number 1 versus door number 2. Imagine behind door number 1 was a check made out to you in the amount of 850,000 US dollars. You can choose door number 1. So if you choose door number 1, you get that check. But behind door number 2, it's a check for $1 million US dollars. But beside that $1 million check is a pair of dice. If you choose this door number 2, you have to roll the dice. If you do so, there's an 85% chance to be given the $1 million check, combined with the 15% chance you won't be given anything. So most people ask, well, would you have a preference there, Deepak? Door number 1 versus door number 2? The sure gain versus the potentially greater gain. Most of us choose door number 1. We go for the sure thing, even though we could have potentially done better with the other option. But if you think about that in the domain of losses, imagine if what's behind door number 1, it's a check that you've written that you have to give to me if you choose door number 1, and it's in the amount of 850,000 US dollars. So you can either choose door number 1, where you'll be facing a sure loss of 850,000, or door number 2, and let me tell you what's behind door number 2. It's a check that you've written out to me. This time it's for $1 million, but beside the $1 million check drawn on your bank account is a pair of dice. If you choose door number 2, you get to roll the dice. If you do so, there's only an 85% chance you have to give me the $1 million check, but a 15% chance you don't have to give me anything. Most people choose that option, the risky option. They're symmetrical, but in the first example where people are choosing between positive options, they tend to go for the sure thing, the risk-averse option. In the second example, they avoid the sure thing, which happens to be a loss, expose themselves to potentially greater losses. So you see a different orientation to risk. People are generally risk-averse in the domain of gains, risk-seeking in the domain of losses.
Could you share some notable real-world examples where poor framing led to significant business or policy failures?
I can. Just before I give you some examples, the reason why it's significant that the reason why it matters that people are risk-seeking in the domain of gains versus risk-averse and risk-seeking in the domain of losses, risk-averse in the domain of gains, is because it's quite easy to frame or perceive or understand a choice to be either in the domain of gains or the domain of losses, merely by how the decision is presented. So And it's not that reality doesn't matter. Reality does matter, but what matters is what you compare that reality with. So let me give an example, Deepak. Would you describe 10 degrees Celsius as being warm? Probably not where you are, right? 10 degrees Celsius
Yes.
for me, the end of winter in northeastern North America, that's a beautiful temperature. Would you describe somebody as 6 feet tall? Well, you ask a professional basketball player versus the average person, they'd give you a different answer. Is $100,000 a year salary a lot? Well, it depends what you're making. Is 40 old, Deepak? It depends how old you are, right? So it's not that there is an objective reality here, but how one perceives the reality is a function of what one is comparing that reality to. Decision making is very much like that. What are we comparing the choices with? If we compare them to something that causes us to see the situation as if it were a choice between losses, we're much more oriented to take risks than if we perceive the same options relative to a different point of reference, causing us to perceive a choice in the domain of gains. So you asked for some examples. So Deepak, forgive me if I wander from the realm of business into the world of geopolitics. I think a wonderful example of the power of framing effects to lead to very bad decisions would be this: the Russian decision, the decision, I should say, of Vladimir Putin, supported by his inner circle, to launch a so-called special military operation in Ukraine. So that was done over 3 years ago today. At the time, his assumption was he could waltz in, the Ukrainians would welcome him, it would be over in a matter of hours. And well, here we are 3 years later, in the midst of a massive crisis of epic proportion, as the world is changing around us with massive consequences. So Putin, I think it's quite clear, Putin understood he was trying to restore the Soviet Empire, perceived the current position of Russia as negative relative to the past, what it was in its former glory, and the attempts to annex Ukraine are an attempt to resolve that deficit, that negative situation. And by the way, he not only does it illustrate a classic example of decision fiasco, a strategic imbecility, I would suggest, as certainly historians and commentators describe it. But the worst type of decision failure is one where not only was the decision flawed at the outset and was basically doomed to fail, was contaminated by so many errors during the decision-making process that it was predestined to fail. The classic and perhaps the worst example, the most egregious type of decision failure is one where not only was the initial decision flawed, but when it becomes obvious that the initial decision was flawed, the tendency is to double down and intensify and continue further down the wrong road, which is exactly what Putin is doing with respect to Ukraine, continuing to invest additional resources in what may well be a faint hope. Now, the interesting thing about studying this area is that we're talking big decisions made under risk. Evidently, a bad decision made very poorly, not only the initial decision, but the decision to escalate. But hey, unpredictable events, it may turn out that Putin gets rescued by Trump, and to be determined. That story is still, but that reflects, if that happens from the Russian perspective and the Putin perspective, you can't attribute that to Putin's great insight into the future. It would be just through sheer good luck. And I mean, I could give you other examples. The decision of Boeing to redesign its 737 MAX 8 in a way that was flawed, that ended up crashing. That was, I think, in response to Airbus's innovation with respect to making more efficient airplane engines. Boeing had to respond. They were in a negative position. They should have redesigned the 737, not put the new engines, the more fuel efficient engines, improperly on the wings to cause the tendency to do what an airplane shouldn't do, which is why they added all the software to address the errors, which led to the the two preventable crashes. The other error, of course, that Boeing made was not only did they make a strategic error with respect to the design of the Max 8, after the planes fell out of the sky because of reasons that they fully understand were related to the redesign, they continued to try to keep the plane in the air, and the only reason why it was pulled out of the sky was federal aviation authorities across the globe were pulling them down. I could go on, Deepak, but I suspect that's probably not what you want me to do here in terms of examples.
Professor, how does cognitive bias interact with framing effects? Are certain biases more prone to causing decision failure in high-stake environments?
Well, there are lots of, so we suffer as a species from bias because we are hardwired, we've evolved as a species to rely on heuristics to make decisions rapidly when operating in what psychologists often refer to as system one type thinking. We're operating based on intuition and emotion and gut feel. So when we're operating in that mode, we're relying on heuristics, and heuristics they tend to serve us very well, but under certain conditions, they can lead us to make mistakes, and we know where the soft points are. That's why they're biased, they're systematic, and they're reliable deviations from rationality. So we suffer from many of these things. And the bad news is, I think, Deepak, with respect to bias, is that we're not very good at recognizing our own biases because they are rooted in our intuitions and our emotions and how we are hardwired to think and make decisions under uncertainty. The good news is, if there is any good news here, is that other people are much better at recognizing our own biases than we are. So that's a good rationale for having a strong board of directors who can audit the quality of a management recommendation for bias. And there are many such biases, not just loss aversion, which is an important bias. Anchoring is another bias. There was a whole list of them. We've cataloged many dozens of biases. So not that we're irrational, but we're in some sense predictably irrational. And although we're not good at recognizing our own biases, others are much better at that. And so if we have a governance process whereby we have another level of oversight with respect to top management team decision making, there is some hope there. But examples of bias that contaminate important is the planning fallacy, the tendency to underestimate how long something is going to take, how much it's going to cost, what the benefits are going to be. It's classic, the sunk cost fallacy, the tendency to consider sunk costs relevant in future courses of action. There's a whole litany of them. Loss aversion is an important bias, which can get triggered by framing if you perceive the decision as a choice between losses. That tends to engage loss aversion. We as a species find sure loss as highly aversive. I think there's some survival value in being sensitive to negative information, to losses. But the downside is that when we are making choices between losses, this tends to elicit a preference for risk, and that can lead us to do things that we would not otherwise have done had we framed or understood the decision to be other than a choice in the domain of losses.
What strategies can leaders use to recognize and counteract the framing effect in corporate decision making?
Well, framing effects, which can lead to imprudent decision you would have made had you framed the decision differently, they're like a whole category of other types of bias in some sense. I think the main protection, the main prophylactic against decision failure is to have a good decision-making process, to have an intelligent process by which you make decisions. I think it's one way you can evaluate the caliber of a leader. How do they make decisions? Do they make decisions whimsically, spontaneously, impulsively, without much reflection or analysis? Or do they only make important decisions after having thought about the objectives, thought about the alternatives, gathered information, evaluate the alternatives, thought about the risk, try to mitigate the risks, develop implementation plans and contingency plans if things don't go well. These are in some sense the steps that characterize a good decision-making process. It's not that those steps guarantee a successful result, but if you do engage in the steps that characterize a good process, you're simply less likely to be making avoidable mistakes. You're less likely to make the mistakes that if you do make are likely to torpedo the kind of decision that the kind of objectives that you're attempting to achieve with whatever decision you're trying to make. So number one, have a good decision-making process in place. Number two, I think to take your time to slow the process down. I'm not saying if you're in a crisis, I think by definition, you're going to have to respond quickly. But even within those available those constraints, if you take whatever time you have available, you're allowing for the process of some reflection, the gathering of evidence, analysis, which is a way to overcome the potential biases that we're prone to because we tend to rely on our intuition. And so what we do as a species, Debbie, here's what I tend to use these sorts of cliches. Evidence-based decision-making is a very, I think, useful tool with which to make important decisions, but we're much more inclined as a species to engage in what I think is more accurately described as decision-based evidence-making. We first make the decision, and then we use our considerable intellect and talents to gather information and make up reasons to support the decision that we initially made impulsively. And sadly, you see that far too often. And if you're making decisions impulsively without having thought about the alternatives and the goals and gathered evidence, and done some analysis and tried to mitigate the risk and so on, you're making mistakes. And as those avoidable mistakes accumulate, the likelihood that the decision you make ends up badly simply is going up and up and up and up and up.
Very insightful. Professor, do framing effects impact group decisions differently than individual decisions? If so, how can organizations safeguard against collective decision failures?
So, Dave, that's a great point because very few consequential decisions are made by an individual acting in isolation. The vast majority, probably almost all transformational strategic decisions are made by a group. Now, usually that group, I think, certainly in the corporate tradition, that group is usually led by an individual who is final authority, but that individual is advised by and supported by a senior management team or a top management team, an inner circle. Why wouldn't scrutiny by this inner circle, in some sense, eliminate the possibility that the flawed judgment of the leader ends up being reflected in the ultimate decision? And the question is very much like this. Are two heads better than one, which is the theory underlying collective decision-making, or is a camel a horse designed by a committee? And interestingly, with respect to loss aversion and framing effects, so we've already discussed that when groups frame a decision as a choice between losses, at the individual level, there's a propensity to be more comfortable with risk, to seek a much riskier option than would otherwise have been found tolerable. So what's the effect of group discussion? Well, there's some predictable consequences of group discussion, one of which is called, wait for it, Deepak, group polarization. So I apologize for using psychological buzzwords, but this refers to the tendency for group discussion to amplify the dominant inclination that existed at the outset of the discussion. So in other words, if the group is populated by people who have a general inclination toward responding in a risky way, the predictable consequence of group discussion is to amplify that particular bias or that particular inclination. So particularly if a group is led by somebody who's oriented to do something off the charts or perhaps questionable or sketchy or imprudent or even unethical, he's likely to infect others in his inner circle who are, by the way, are probably there for very specific reasons. Powerful people need people who don't need them, but they tend to surround themselves with people who who tell them what they want to hear. It's just exaggerating the biases that they bring. So I think the consequence of group discussion, sadly, is very often not to eliminate the bias of the leader, but rather to amplify it. And I think, you can probably see that again. I can use a political example, the Trump inner circle with respect to the global trade war that's unfolding, perhaps other decisions here. We know that people are telling him what he wants to hear. People have been intimidated into. That's what strong leaders often do. They surround themselves with people who they know are going to tell them what they want to hear, and the consequence is they make a bad leader potentially even worse by amplifying their worst excesses.
In the context of scenario described, why do business leaders often feel more compelled to act when facing losses than when presented with potential gains?
I think that's just I think generally they do. I think for the same reason that most of us would respond in that way. We display a trait or a bias called loss aversion in the human experience, perhaps as a result of evolution. And we're all related. We all evolved on the savannah, hunting and being hunted. Losses are regarded by humanity. This isn't a cultural predisposition, by humanity, as much more salient from a psychological perspective than our comparable gains. We weight them much more heavily. So I'll give you an example. Would you toss a coin under the following conditions? If it's heads, I'll give you $100. But if it's tails, you have to give me $100. So what I'm proposing is a gamble where you have an equal chance of winning or losing the same amount. We as a species don't like that type of gamble. The pain, if that's the right word, associated with losing 100 is not compensated by the pleasure, if that's the right word, of winning 100. So if I were to say to you, maybe Deepak, heads, I'll give you 500, tails, you only have to give me 100, then maybe you'd flip that coin. But losses dominate gains psychologically. Losses are weighted much more heavily than our comparable gains. It may not be an order of magnitude difference, but it could be 3, 4, 5 times more significantly. So that means we're way more accurately described as being a species more focused on avoiding loss than seeking gains. So that's why I think leaders in general are highly sensitive. In fact, loss aversion is an important source of underperformance in organizations. When people avoid taking prudent risks, avoid taking advisable risks, because they're so worried about suffering from the consequences if it doesn't work out as they. That's why boards think very carefully about the compensation system they put in place for their senior executives to overcome this tendency toward loss aversion, to be more cautious than perhaps is helpful from an organizational performance perspective.
Professor, are there practical ways to structure decision-making process to minimize errors?
I think there are. I mean, one is to have good oversight, good institutional governance processes. In the government context, you wouldn't just have an executive that can make decisions like an autocratic situation where a Putin makes all the decisions. You should have other legislative bodies that have some oversight. The same thing with a board of directors. Organizations need effective boards to exercise some degree of oversight as they collaborate with their chief executives, and maybe they can add value by auditing the quality of an executive recommendation for bias, for example. So I think having good structures is important. I think having a good decision-making process generally is important. I think one way to assess the caliber of a leader, as I said earlier, Deepak, is how do they make decisions? Do they make them typically in a systematic way that reflects an intelligent process, that reflects a problem-solving oriented process, or do they make them whimsically, impulsively, on the basis of pride, greed, wrath, envy? I could go on and on and on, and I won't mention any names. One can see these influences on even the most important of choices. So one would hope that high stakes would would induce more rationality, but sadly, often high stakes makes people even less rational than they would otherwise be inclined to be.
Dr. White, have there been empirical studies measuring the tangible financial or strategic consequences of framing effects in business settings?
So, Deepak, the short answer is not as many as I would like. I mean, studying decision making in the wild is difficult. For example, if you want to, especially private sector or public company decisions, there often aren't traces of the decision-making process available for research to study. Governments are a bit different because ultimately, certainly some governments anyway, will have audio tapes, will have detailed minutes, and even if they aren't available in real time, they do become available over time in the next in 10 years, 20 years, whenever, for studies. So it is hard to study these things in the wild. There are lots of examples, though, of studies that have looked at the tendency for people to, when they frame decisions negatively, to embrace risk, to embrace much more risk than they'd otherwise be comfortable to embrace. There's lots of evidence that of risk seeking by troubled firms, excessively risk. It's almost like the tendency to bet on a long shot on the last race of the day after you've probably already suffered losses at the track, and so you're much more inclined to be much riskier when you're facing otherwise sure losses. Or people gambling, in one way to rectify the loss they suffered is to blow what remains on a long shot, which has maybe a big payoff but has a very very little chance of being successful. So certainly lots of evidence of the tendency of risk seeking by trouble, which is really what we're talking about. The tendency that those firms would in general be very much inclined to frame subsequent strategic decisions as a choice between losses where the status quo was not an option, because the status quo was probably that put them on the cusp of bankruptcy. So you'll see to use a football metaphor, a Hail Mary pass possibly, because otherwise they're going out of business. So there is certainly there's a considerable amount of body of evidence of these sorts of findings. Not so much in the decision-making field that actually looks at the real-time decision-making of top management team, but certainly one area that should be addressed.
In corporate environments, decision framing is sometimes used to shape consumer perception. Where should businesses draw the ethical line in applying framing techniques?
Interesting. There is decision framing. There's no question that marketers understand this implicitly. Politicians also in framing choices for the public, and I think intuitively they've understood these, and skilled politicians and skilled marketers intuitively understand the effects and power of framing things differently. There is quite a large body of literature on the psychology of persuasion and influence. Much of it authored by a very widely cited social psychologist named Robert Cialdini. And he talks specifically about one way to make your good case well is to frame it for people, to explain to people the losses they will suffer if they don't do what you were suggesting, as opposed to explaining to them the benefits they will enjoy if they do what you're suggesting. So, and the reason why that's one way to increase your amount of persuasion is because you're getting a bigger bang for your buck. People are much more responsive to losses than to gains. So as to the ethical issues, he does spend some time in that book talking about this. And I would say, in some sense, Deepak, that in that context, that's above my pay grade. And I'm not sure. I think reasonable people would differ. I think the issue is probably, what is your intent when you're framing these decisions? What is your intent? Is your intent to help people make the best possible decision, or you're trying to manipulate them and mislead them into doing something they wouldn't otherwise do? I think that's probably where you want to go, and I think that's something that anyone listening to this call would have some views on.
Professor, my last question: what areas of decision science and framing effects still need deeper exploration? Are there any emerging technologies or AI-driven solutions that can help mitigate decision failures?
I think there are lots of decision tools or aids that one can employ when making a decision. Let me give you an example of one. The newspaper test. So imagine you're contemplating making an important decision, a strategic decision, a transformational decision, and you're not quite sure. Maybe you're not quite sure about the ethical or reputational consequences. So apply the newspaper test, and that just simply suggests that before you act on an impulse, imagine you had done so, and imagine that a reporting of what you had done ends up on the front page of you choose the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, you choose the publication. What implications would that have for you? How would you feel about that? How would you respond to that level of publicity? So it's not that the right answer emerges from the application of such tools, but these are ways to sharpen your judgment when that judgment is being affected negatively by the incentives that are at play. So there's a whole bunch of these kinds of tests. I think, though, in general, Deepak, good decision making is much more a product of perspiration rather than inspiration. That it's much more about your ability to have an adult conversation, to have a good conversation, which is dependent on the culture of your organization that tolerates having that kind of conversation. I don't think it's about us being smarter. I think we're pretty smart. I think we have, at least some of us have some level of wisdom and capacity. But I don't think there's any, if there's any magical technology that will somehow, make better decisions than we're capable of making as a species, I'm not aware of it. And I think that's in some sense probably a red herring or illusory. I think it's all up to us, but it's up to the kind of cultures we create. Are we able to create the kind of culture that allows us to engage in the sort of steps that characterize a good decision-making process? If we do have such a culture, we're going to make fewer mistakes. And if we make fewer mistakes, whatever direction we choose to go in is more likely to be successful than if we made those mistakes. I think it's pretty much down to that.
Professor Glen Whyte, it has been an absolute privilege to have you on today's episode. Your insights into decision failures, the role of framing effects, and the strategies to mitigate judgment errors have provided a fascinating and deeper, relevant and perspectives for business leaders, policymakers, and individuals alike. Your extensive research and expertise in negotiation, risk management, and corporate governance has shed light on the complexities of decision making, helping us understand not just why failures occur, but also how to prevent them. The real world applications of your work are truly invaluable, and I'm sure our listeners will walk away with a new lens through which to view their own decision making processes. Thank you once again, Professor Glen Whyte, for joining us on Business Talk and for sharing your time and expertise.
Deepak, the pleasure has been mine.
Thank you.